Cedar Ridge High's endless hallway had always been an urban legend whispered during lunch breaks, but few actually dared to explore it. Most believed it was nothing more than a maintenance tunnel or a forgotten construction project. Still, no one could explain why it seemed to appear and disappear at random, or why students rumored to have entered it sometimes dropped out of school or vanished entirely. One Friday, fueled by arrogance and curiosity, I decided to see it for myself. My friends tagged along for moral support, but they stopped as soon as we reached the gray, unmarked double doors leading to the hallway. "Go ahead," my friend Derek teased. "If you're not back in 10 minutes, we'll call someone and maybe." With a flashlight in hand and my phone recording, I stepped inside. At first, it looked just like any other school corridor, with worn tiles, lockers lining the walls, and faint graffiti scrawled by previous troublemakers. The air, however, was noticeably colder, and the silence was oppressive. I glanced back to see my friends watching from the doorway, but when I turned forward again, the hallway stretched endlessly. The lockers became rusted, their doors slightly ajar. A rancid smell hit my nose like rotting meat and mildew. 30 steps in, the walls shifted. The pristine beige paint faded into a warped, fleshy texture, and black veins seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Faces began to emerge from the walls, distorted and pained. Their mouths opened in silent screams, and the faint sound of whispering began. I panicked and turned back to the entrance. My heart dropped when I realized it was gone. The hallway extended both ways infinitely. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak against the darkness that crept closer, threatening to engulf me. "Help me," a voice called softly from behind. I froze, not daring to look. "Turn around," the voice urged, weaker now, sounding closer. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a figure slumped against the wall. At first I thought it was another student, a possible prank, but their head tilted unnaturally to the side, and their sunken, hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Don't you recognize me?" they rasped. It was Jamie, a student who had disappeared 3 years prior. His skin was pale and sagging like wax melting off his bones. He reached toward me with fingers that looked like bone wrapped in decayed flesh, and I ran. The whispers grew louder, their overlapping voices clawing at my sanity as I ran. The faces in the walls moved now, tracking me with eyeless sockets. Just when I thought I would collapse from exhaustion, a door appeared in front of me. I didn't hesitate. I burst through it, slamming it shut behind me. To my shock, I was back in the school, surrounded by my confused and concerned friends. The hall behind me was just a regular corridor again, no endless stretch, no haunting faces. But something followed me. At night, I hear faint knocking on my bedroom walls. Math was the last class I expected to haunt me, but when Ms. Lorna arrived as our substitute, everything changed. Mr. Granger had always been punctual, so his sudden disappearance raised questions. The principal vaguely mentioned a family emergency, but something didn't sit right. Ms. Lorna introduced herself with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked ancient, with deep wrinkles and bony fingers that seemed too long. Her voice was strange, too. Raspy and layered, as though two people were speaking in unison. Rather than teaching us algebra, she handed out blank notebooks. "Today," she said, "we'll be documenting our greatest fears. Be as detailed as possible." No one wanted to argue. I wrote about my fear of drowning, describing how water feels like a weight pressing into your chest. My friend Jenna detailed her fear of being buried alive, and Kyle mentioned his phobia of spiders. It seemed like a harmless exercise until Jenna didn't show up for class the next day. That evening, the news broke. Her body had been found in an old cemetery just outside of town, buried alive. The eerie part? There were no signs of struggle, almost as if she went willingly. It didn't stop there. Kyle collapsed during school the following week, a spider bite triggering an allergic reaction. He swore he saw spiders crawling all over him before blacking out, but no one else could see them. Terrified, I burned my notebook in a backyard fire pit. For a moment, I felt relief. But then I started seeing water everywhere, faucets dripping, puddles appearing out of nowhere, and my showers filling up faster than the drain could manage. The worst moment came when I woke up choking, water rushing down my throat even though I was in bed. Ms. Lorna disappeared before I could confront her, but I know she's still out there. collecting fears, feeding off of them, and waiting for her next class. Joining Cedar Ridge High's choir was supposed to be an easy elective. Singing wasn't exactly my passion, but it was better than gym class. Besides, Ms. Harland was a kind, if eccentric, instructor. That was true until she introduced the song. The sheet music looked ancient, the paper yellowed and brittle. The notes seemed oddly placed with jagged phrasing and erratic time signatures. None of us could make sense of it, but Ms. Harland insisted we try. Music isn't always meant to be understood, she told us. Sometimes it just is. The first time we sang it, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, almost stifling. Afterward, several students said they felt lightheaded. By the end of the week, 2 students dropped out, claiming that the song had invaded their dreams, filling their minds with unending, dissonant melodies. By the time our first performance arrived, only 8 of us remained. As we sang, the lights in the auditorium dimmed, shadows flickered at the edges of the stage, and the audience grew uncomfortably silent, as though they weren't entirely there. Afterward, one of the audience members, a local pastor, confronted Miss Harland. "That song," he said shakily, "it isn't meant for us. Where did you find it?" Ms. Harland only smiled and walked away. The following week, rehearsals became unbearable. Each verse we sang brought an overwhelming pressure in the room, like the walls were closing in. On the final rehearsal, 3 of the remaining students collapsed mid-performance, their bodies twitching violently on the floor. That was when we noticed the shadows on the walls weren't ours anymore. They stretched unnaturally, moving even when we stood still. Their mouths opened silently, mocking us. Ms. Harland refused to stop, insisting we finish the song. Her eyes now gleamed with an unnatural light, and her smile widened far beyond human capability. When the shadows began stepping off the walls, taking solid, human-like forms, I dropped my music and ran. The school canceled the choir program that week, claiming it was due to budget cuts. Ms. Harland was never seen again, but sometimes, on sleepless nights, I hear faint singing outside my window, a twisted, haunting melody that pulls at my soul. The rumors about Crestwood High's final bell were more than just talk. They were warnings. But as a junior, I assumed it was nothing more than some dumb myth to scare freshmen into avoiding after-school activities. It wasn't until I worked late as a student monitor that I realized just how real it was. That evening, the building felt strange once the other students left. The usual hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder, almost buzzing inside my head. Only a few people remained: the janitor, a teacher grading papers, and me. I finished my duties quickly, but as the last bell rang at 7 p.m., a shiver ran down my spine. The school didn't feel empty anymore. As I made my way to the front doors, I heard faint whispers echoing through the halls. I stopped to listen, but the voices vanished. Then I heard it, a locker slamming shut at the far end of the hallway. "Hello, anyone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity dragged me forward. The farther I went, the darker it became, as if the building itself were swallowing the light. The hallway stretched impossibly long, far beyond its usual length. Finally, I reached the end and turned into the gym. The clock above the bleachers blinked 00 ISR. The air turned icy cold and the bell rang again, slower this time, distorted and broken. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps thundered behind me. I turned, expecting to see the janitor or maybe a prankster. Instead, I saw her. She looked like one of us, a high school student, but there was something wrong. Her head tilted too far to one side and her eyes glowed faintly. "You stayed too long," she whispered, her voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "Now you're part of the school." She lunged at me and I ran. The halls twisted and turned into a maze, each door locked. The whispers grew louder, shouting my name as I fled. Finally, I burst through the front doors into the parking lot. I never worked late again, but I'll always remember the janitor's face when I told him what happened. "You saw her, huh?" he said quietly. "Next time you won't get out." In the art room at Hillside High, there was a mirror that no one dared to touch. It had been there for decades, always leaning against the back wall and covered with a heavy cloth. Everyone had a story about why it was there, but no one knew for sure. One stormy afternoon, stuck in detention, I decided to see what the fuss was about. The power flickered as I pulled the cloth away. The mirror was massive, its frame an intricate design of twisting vines and screaming faces. The glass was polished to perfection, reflecting every detail with unsettling clarity. As I stared into it, I felt off. My reflection looked normal, but something in its eyes seemed different. At first it mimicked me perfectly, but when I tilted my head it lagged behind, pausing before matching my movements. A sick feeling churned in my stomach when it smiled. I wasn't smiling back. Then it whispered. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was like wind rushing through an empty canyon, chilling me to my core. Panicking, I tried to cover it again, but the cloth wouldn't stay. The lights in the room went out completely and the whispering grew louder, building to an ear-piercing screech. In the mirror, my reflection tilted its head again, but this time it cracked, its face splitting down the middle as black liquid poured out. It stepped forward, not in the glass but in the room with me. I screamed and ran, not stopping until I was outside the school. I swore I'd never go back, but that night, I found shards of broken glass scattered across my bedroom floor, each one reflecting that same sinister smile. It was supposed to be an ordinary Monday, but the moment I walked into room 305 for first period history, I knew something was wrong. The air felt dense, like walking into an attic during a summer storm. A strange smell lingered, something metallic, like rust and decay. Our usual teacher, Mr. Carter, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a substitute greeted us. She didn't look much older than us, early 20s maybe, but there was something off about her. Her pale skin looked too smooth, almost waxy, and her dark, glossy eyes seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "I'm Ms. Holloway," she said, her voice soft but resonating oddly in the room. "I'll be covering class for a little while." She didn't explain why Mr. Carter wasn't there. The lesson started strangely. Instead of our usual Civil War unit, Ms. Holloway handed out thick, weathered notebooks, each bound in a dark, cracking material that looked too much like aged leather. Inside, the pages were blank except for a small heading written in faded ink. "Your story." "You'll write about yourselves," Ms. Holloway instructed. "Your fears, your desires, your deepest truths." We all exchanged awkward glances, unsure what to do, but something in her expression made us comply. Her eyes were cold yet unblinking, like they were daring us to resist. As I wrote, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. It was as if the notebook was pulling my thoughts directly from my brain, digging deeper than I intended. I described dreams I had tried to forget, ones of endless hallways, of black water swallowing me whole. The pen moved faster than my hand could control. Around me, the room felt darker, as though the light from the windows was fading. My classmates wrote furiously, their heads bent low. That's when the screaming started. I looked up to see Lucas, the class clown, clutching his head and yelling, "It's not real, it's not real," before collapsing to the floor. Miss Holloway didn't move. She simply smiled and murmured, "He'll adjust." We wanted to rush to him, but something held us back. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It felt like invisible hands had gripped our arms and legs, rooting us to our desks. One by one, the room seemed to consume the light, leaving shadows that flickered unnaturally. I swore I could see shapes moving in the corners, dark, twisting figures with no faces. And then, one by one, students started vanishing. It wasn't instant. It was as if they were dissolving, their bodies turning to mist that was pulled into the shadows. Each time it happened, Ms. Holloway's smile grew wider. "Keep writing," she urged softly. "You must finish your story before class is over." The ones who vanished left their notebooks behind, still open on the desk. Their last entries ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off into nothingness. Panic surged through me, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My pen kept moving, seemingly on its own. It felt as though the notebook was drawing my soul out of my body. "Please stop," I begged. "What is this?" "This is your chance to leave your mark," Ms. Holloway replied, her voice serene and cruel. "We don't all get second chances after all." The clock on the wall read 8:52 a.m. Class was supposed to end at 9, but with each passing second, the hands of the clock spun faster, almost mockingly. The air became heavier, stifling. Finally, only 3 of us remained. Me, Sarah from the volleyball team, and Peter, a quiet kid who never said much. The rest of the desks were empty, the faint outlines of our vanished classmates swirling in the shadows. "I'm not writing another word," Sarah screamed, throwing her notebook onto the floor. Ms. Holloway's smile faltered for the first time. "You must finish your story," she said, her tone darker now. "If you stop—" The room trembled as Sarah's notebook caught fire on the floor, the flames unnaturally blue. Sarah screamed as her body lifted off the ground, her limbs twisting at impossible angles before she dissolved into mist. That left Peter and me. My pen moved faster, desperate to finish something, anything, but the shadows seemed closer now, breathing heavily against my back. Then, just as the clock struck 9 for Peter finished his story. He gasped as his notebook slammed shut, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. He fell to the floor unconscious, but the shadows left him alone. I wasn't as lucky. My hand trembled as I tried to finish my last sentence, but the words blurred together. My pen froze as Ms. Holloway loomed over me. "Too late," she whispered. The shadows wrapped around me, cold and suffocating, pulling me backward into their endless void. The last thing I saw was Ms. Holloway's empty, satisfied smile. I woke up days later in the school infirmary. Peter was there too, but he refused to speak to anyone. The rest of the class was never found. I later learned that Ms. Holloway's name didn't exist on any records. There was no substitute teacher, no explanation for what had happened.